So, have you ever played a game, especially an older one, and enjoyed it? You know, had a good time and all, but there's just that something to it that you feel is holding it back in some way. Well, that's exactly the time I had back in 2018 with Ice Climber. I sat down and played the whole game front to back, had a great time, and the game really managed to stick in my head. Because it feels so unique, especially as a platformer. It came from that magical early era where video games were starting to pick up speed, but were also still a largely brand new medium, and people were just figuring out what to do with it early. And moreover, Ice Climber is one of those games that did something very specific that got left by the wayside when the popular game genres started to crystallize. Like, you don't really see any other platformers out there quite like Ice Climber. The medium of video games is so vast, and there are so many ideas out there and so many things to do with them, so many ways they could be built upon, and so it often feels like such a shame that many of these early ideas got so left behind. And that was the aspect, the neglected nature of the format, combined with, you know, feeling like it was a bit held back by some shortcomings, and feeling like a first draft of the concept that led me to decide to be the one to give it a second draft, and also a third draft, but we'll get to that later. There were two main ideas behind my Ice Climber spiritual successor, which were core gameplay changes and adding variety. One of my biggest issues with Ice Climber was just feeling like it was a bit on the repetitive side. There's only like a few core mechanics to this game, which, you know, is not necessarily an issue. I do like the game design philosophy of having only a few mechanics and exploring them to their fullest extent. Though I feel like this game maybe doesn't explore them the most. It doesn't explore them as much as it could, you know? And there's not a huge amount of room to do interesting things with what we've got here, with like having just a few enemies that you've got and all that kind of stuff. The game just, it doesn't really go anywhere with its concepts, you know? So that was really a major motivation behind my redoing the concept. The gameplay changes were made mostly right out the gate, one of the biggest being trying to improve air control. One of my biggest issues with Ice Climber is just that the jumping feels horrid. It's a very high but slow jump with basically no air control, and the trajectory is pitiful, almost entirely vertical, and even after hours of playing, I still feel like I can't quite judge where my jumps are going to end up every time. I think one of the worst aspects of it in particular is just how slow it is, because you just have to commit to a jump the moment you make it because of the lack of air control. It takes so long before you get to correct it, because you just have to wait until you land. And so when there's stuff moving around and things you're trying to avoid and stuff like that, and you're committed to a jump that you didn't really want to make, it just sucks. However, I did like the height of the jump and the resulting distance between the layers. So to increase control, I made the jump into a double jump. I know there's some debate out there about the utility of double jumps in video games. Oh, you know, just make the jump longer. But here I think it really does the trick. Like, in a lot of games, you can change jump heights via holding down the button for varying lengths of time, but that can often be like vague, you know? Like, it can work, but I feel like the mushiness and vagueness of the mechanic means that it's not the end-all be-all of jump control, you know? Even though it works, I feel like it can be a bit of a drawback to feel like you're unsure of exactly how high your jump is going to be every time because of the imprecise nature of trying to time a button press. Although, of course, that is a little bit of a skill issue on my part. I'm very bad at doing things with specific timings like that, which is why you'll really never see me trying to play a rhythm game. But again, I think it means that there is room for other approaches to jump height control. If your jump is just cut into two, you get two distinct heights to choose from, as well as still having the ability to extend a jump in midair. Plus, you can double jump while descending, which opens up some fun possibilities. And in the end, I'm just really happy with how the jumping turned out in general. I also removed the requirement of having to stay ahead of the bottom of the screen. I felt like being able to move down was just another area where I could explore more concepts and add variety. Like being able to do these big jumps on springs and stuff without the fear of having to fall back down and lose progress. And also I just felt that it was very annoying and punishing in Ice Climber, to be honest. The enemies got some changes too. I kept the same tropes of a little guy who repairs the block layers and a flying enemy, but upgraded them in a couple of ways. Firstly, I changed it so that only one block gets replaced at a time, rather than the two from Ice Climber. So to compensate for the slower block replacement rate, great. I made the enemies a lot faster. And the flying enemies now chase after the player more directly instead of the more meandery flight path they took in Ice Climber to make things a bit more dynamic. I think they feel a lot more threatening now. Keep you on your toes just a little bit more. I improved moving platforms by making you be able to jump up through the bottom of them instead of needing to go around the side. And I also made them impart momentum on you even when attacking. It was really hard to attack stuff from a moving platform in Ice Climber. I also ended up ditching the bonus level thing at the top of the stage, though I did keep the narrowing background tiles on the sides, and the 5 food items to collect, which I instead moved to hidden locations throughout the stages. The thought process there was to add something more to do while climbing. Having something to explore and look for along the way is a small change, but I think it does a lot for making it feel more fun and giving it some more variety than just plainly climbing up there every time. Also, partially to make up for the lack of a bonus level, and to add one more little wrinkle to the mix, I added a flag that you've got to pick up and bring to the top of the stage at the end, which also is just that little bit of extra satisfaction, you know? It's just really fun to plant that flag at the top, I think. I also included icicles, though I changed how they worked a bit compared to Ice Climber. Instead of forming at random and falling on their own, they are at set locations and fall only when you get near them. This was kind of necessary because after all of the other changes I'd made, doing icicles that way ended up feeling like way too harsh. And after that, everything is just me building on the original concept, adding more types of enemies, adding spikes, and one of the biggest changes was I decided it would be cool if there were some side-scrolling levels. Once those started getting added, that's when this game really started to come into its own and become something new and special compared to Ice Climber, I think. Oh, and speaking of those spikes, I get complimented on those extremely often, and it's for one particular reason. You can stand on the flat sides of them without getting hurt. I didn't realize that was going to be such a big deal for people. I only did it because I thought it made logical sense, and I'm really glad that it's something everyone loves so much. It has been so fun that is something people so consistently comment on. I had no idea people were going to love it so much, but it's amused me quite a bit to hear it every single time somebody plays this game. And funny enough, because I did them this way, I eventually wanted to add a hazard that does damage you from all sides, which led me to the creation of the Borbo, my lovable take on the ever-present 2D platformer spike ball hazard. And let me tell you, I've just taken those things and ran with them in the rest of my games. They've become a little bit of a mascot of my games. It's fun, you know? I also, of course, decided to go with 4 different worlds, which also allowed a lot more room for exploration of the mechanics that Ice Climber had. Like, what if some of the blocks had different properties, like taking more hits to break or being slippery? What if there was lava? What if I had cool set pieces? What if you climbed a spooky Castlevania-esque tower? I also made a set of purely visual changes, like replacing Ice Climber's odd, non-animating conveyor belts with running water and running lava too, and making the cloud platforms, well, more like cloud. I tried to make the game more visually coherent. Each world looks consistent and like space, where Ice Climber had this sort of hodgepodge look to it, sort of random colors and shapes that, well, you know, I do like how the game looks, but it's kind of weird to see the enemies trot out a piece of ice that somehow turns into a green or brown thing when it gets placed, you know? With all of this, I think I really managed to beat the lack of variety that I felt with the original Ice Climber, and made something with a lot more intrigue and a nice increasing level of complexity and difficulty as you go along. I finished Super Climb Up in 2019, and I was really proud of it at the time. I'd really taken the concept of Ice Climber and built it into much more. The game didn't end up doing very well, though, and over the years since, I put out more successful projects and improved a lot at the craft. So around 2021, when I was working on my previous game, Gray Area, I started thinking about doing a remaster of this game and improving on lots of little things that I thought could still be done better. So one of the first things I did was making the decision to include the tower's location from Super Climb Up as a location in Gray Area. Partially it was to show that both games were taking place in the same world, but also as a sneaky little way to start doing some new graphics for a Super Climb Up remaster. I also put the main enemies from Super Climb Up, the Snurks, in the sewers in Gray Area, but don't worry, they like it in there. The other thing that got the project going was giving the project file over to my friend Cassie, who was one of the main people I was working on Gray Area with, who then went in and experimented and made a bunch of tweaks. One of the first of these was an Ice Climber-ism that I'd sort of blindly left in the game, but that really kind of sorely could have done with improvement, which was not being able to attack in midair. I just sort of took that mechanic from Ice Climber and left it untouched, but I'm really not sure why, especially when most other mechanics of the game got tweaks and improvements in the original version of the game. No idea what compelled me to just leave that one alone, honestly. But as soon as she made it so that you could attack even when not on the ground, it made so much difference. Suddenly flying enemies are less obnoxious, and my favorite, it's now intuitive to smack enemies on the edges of platforms on the way up. Oh, how I enjoy that one! She also made the game feel a lot snappier by making it so that you get knocked back down faster when hitting a block. And her biggest addition, being able to hit blocks from the side with your attack. That one was a huge game changer. It feels so intuitive, and I made use of it in so many places throughout the remaster. Originally, it just broke anything that your attack touched, which I felt was a bit overpowered. You just completely bulldoze your way through everything. So I went to the trouble to reprogram it with a little bit of a smarter system, where blocks can now detect if they're on the outer edge of a cluster, and only those outer blocks get broken during an attack. And I ended up doing that in kind of a funny way. Basically, whenever you attack, any blocks that detect that they're within the area of your attack move themselves towards you, and if they hit any other blocks along the way, that's how they know they're not on the edge. And this all happens within a frame, so you never actually see them move, but it's really funny to me to think about the blocks like marching along on the way every time you attack. But yeah, after that change it still felt good, but it wasn't completely overpowered anymore, and I had so much fun making use of it. And another consequence of this change is that it's possible to break blocks extra fast by both hitting them from below and also swinging the pickaxe at them simultaneously. And during testing, I had a few people point out that this was really satisfying, and one even suggested that I add something about it to the game's tutorial. I didn't end up doing that though, because I noticed quite a few people discovered it on their own, and the people who discovered it always thought doing so was really satisfying, like I mentioned. So I think there's often a desire to make a game as smooth and frictionless as possible, make sure everything is spelled out for the player, things like that. But if you find a nice little gameplay element like this, that's just sort of an emergent property of the mechanics that you've laid out, and that people enjoy discovering on their own, I think it's worthwhile to just let them discover it, you know? And I think in this instance, that kind of thinking worked out particularly well too. She also made some other smaller changes, like speeding up all the transitions and the stage clear screen, which did so much. Like, I went back to the original version of the game as part of making this video, and everything felt so slow. Like, why the hell did I even make it like that? What was I thinking? But yeah, anyway, as for me, the first main thing that I did with this game was overhauling the graphics. I've studied and practiced at pixel art a lot more over the years since I made Super Climb Up originally. Back in those early days, 2018, when I was originally making Super Climb Up, I think I was a bit overconfident with my pixel art. Like, I'm a classically trained artist. I went to art school, learned how to draw with physical media, pencils, paint, that kind of stuff. And as is probably unsurprising to most people, that kind of training didn't necessarily translate itself particularly well to pixel art. I think I would describe my style back then as being a bit MS Paint-like. There's a really big gulf between going from the physical medium to any type of digital medium. I had to sort of reteach myself how to draw in a lot of ways when I moved over to digital as my main medium that I was working in. And like, now I'm really happy with my digital art, and I think that it is better than my physical art was when I was in high school. And I really had to go through a similar process with pixel art. I really thought that I was going for a retro look, but it was more just kind of amateurish, honestly. And so I started paying a lot more attention to the games I was playing, and I looked at a lot of tutorial type things, and I really thought about keeping my color palettes limited and how I was applying color and all those sorts of things. And I think that I have improved immensely. The art I did for this game, I think, is some of my best ever. I'm just really so happy with it, honestly. I think Super Climb Up is no longer a game that I look at and think that I can improve on the visuals. I think this is a really nice looking game. I'm really happy with the lush, lively sort of look that I gave everything. I went for a bit of a realistic, naturalistic type of vibe as much as I could in the style I was working in, where you've got kind of cartoony characters and creatures and stuff like that, but very naturalistic color palettes and a very naturalistic approach to depictions of foliage and grass and all that kind of stuff. So I did play with it a bit on the volcano, and I introduced some nice purples and reds and oranges, just kind of the full spectrum of warm colors to make just sort of this rich palette for everything. And yeah, like I said, I'm just really happy with this. And I feel like I'm doing good as an artist lately. But yeah, after redoing the graphics like that, improving the style, the first big addition was an entire new world, the beach. This is the most explicitly Oregon-inspired location in the game, and also in designing this one, Ice Climber became nothing but a tiny glimmer in the rearview mirror. This was just all about building on the game and the unique mechanics it had developed. I did try to keep it somewhat reasonable difficulty-wise, as it is the new world too, but due to the new complexity and the change in level format, almost none of the stages are in that classic layer-by-layer, totally vertical style. It did end up being a bit of a difficulty increase, but I do kind of like that. Personally, I enjoy when a game has a bit of an up and down difficulty curve, instead of just linearly ramping up the difficulty throughout the entire game. It's nice to give people a chance to decompress a bit after hard parts, I think. Adding in this world also sort of just felt like making a ROM hack of my own game, since the world order was already established as 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 being the bonus world. This now had to become world 5, and there had to be several hard-coded solutions to make the game display them in the order I intended for the player. When you play the game, it's all seamless, this is just world 2, but behind the scenes it's all a bit of a mess, and it's duct taped together in much the same way that it would be if you were doing a ROM hack of something and just tried to shove something new you made into the middle of it. The biggest addition to the game was also the most experimental and ended up taking up almost an entire year of development all on its own. And the original game, to put this into perspective, only took 8 months total. I had the crazy idea to add a zombie horde mode to this game, quite possibly the most insane thing that you could attempt to add to Ice Climber, but that's what I wanted to do. Every single level gets a remixed version where hordes of zombies spawn in and you've got to fight them off. That was the entire idea I had originally, and quite a lot of the early time spent on it was just trying to figure out how I could make it work and make it fun and intriguing, and I really gave it my best shot. I spent so long balancing things and also coming up with different level formats, like levels where you just have to kill as many as you can, or levels where you've got to defend a base, or ones where you have to carry a package and just reach the exit. And those package delivery levels just ended up essentially being a thing where you replay levels, but now the enemy density is massively increased, which I think is a particularly fun way to re-experience a level. I always had in mind that you were going to be able to unlock silly, fun, crazy, and useful items. Some of them are useful, but my main focus was on building the levels, so I really erred on the side of making them doable but extremely difficult without the items, with the idea that hopefully when I started adding the items it would bring everything back down to a more reasonable difficulty level. And well, it wasn't quite that smooth. When I got around to adding the items, there was still some rebalancing and stage redesigning to be done, like making the early levels a lot easier on their own, since, you know, you won't have collected many of the more overpowered items or anything yet at that point. There had to be at least some levels that were reasonable to do still without the items, you know? Personally, I think it turned out really fun, with different types of stages facilitating the use of different items, allowing for some fun strategic elements, like, oh, I know this item is going to work really good on this specific level, you know, that kind of thing. But also, I think it does still have that experimental vibe in the end, but I think that's okay, especially because I kept it relatively short and went for a big fun romp type of feel to it. Originally, you're going to have to redo basically all 75 stages with zombie mode, and it kind of just moved at sort of a glacial pace, like you weren't unlocking new items fast enough. It just didn't work, so I brought it back down to you only got to do about half of them, and then everything sort of went at a much better speed. But in the end, even if it's not everyone's cup of tea, I think everyone will have at least a little bit of fun with it, especially since I also used it to insert more story stuff. The original game was, like Ice Climber, essentially entirely devoid of story, and in the time since, I've done a lot more thinking about video games as a medium for storytelling, as well as developing a larger world and storyline that all my games take place in. So I really wanted to expand Super Climb Up into a vessel to do some more world building and storytelling in that little world that I've got going on. The biggest place I did that in, I think, was in Episode Pizza. This is another segment of the game I had decided I wanted to put in early on, but really had no idea what exactly it was going to be or what it would do special until I got my hands in and started working on it. I knew from the start that I wanted to include a segment following the events of one of my other games, Pizza Time Explosion, to kind of help tie that game in with everything else more. So, you know, the pizza time explosion happens, everything gets covered in pizza. And for the first, like, I guess 2 years or so of development on this, that's all I had in mind. It really started coming together once I decided to have character dialogue, where I can really start giving the characters some personality, since, you know, they essentially had none at all in the original game. And I also tried to add some more personality in a bit more subtly through little cutscenes during the main game, though all of that is still without dialogue. I also came up with the idea of making it a rescue mission, and the character you rescue acts as a bit of a foil to the protagonists, and that worked really well in giving them someone to bounce off of to, again, really show off their personalities in a fun way. Then I started coming up with some stage gimmicks, and I wasn't really sure how those would come together until I just started putting them together as well. That tends to be how I go with things. I have an idea and I start trying it out until I like it. Sometimes that works out right away, and sometimes I really have to work on it, and it might end up completely different by the end. Episode Pizza was somewhere in the middle, I think. One of the main gimmicks was collecting pizza and building it up into an increasingly destructive ball, inspired, of course, by the mechanics of Pizza Time Explosion, which led to 2 interesting things that set this apart from the rest of the game: breaking blocks from above, which you could never do throughout the rest of the game, and gating off progress. Both of these led to a much more puzzly, explory type of level design than the entire rest of the game, and I really like how it turned out, personally. I've had several people point it out as a highlight of the game as well, so I'm super proud of it. And not only that, this part of the game manages to basically completely stop feeling like Ice Climber at all, which I think really speaks to how far the creative process managed to take me in this project. The final culmination of that breakaway from the original inspiration was the Cloud World, the final world that you reach at the very end of the game. This is not a game with very fancy movement or anything like that. It's basically a Mario-like, as I'd call it. Just basic jumping and attacking. But that said, I think even when you have a small set of mechanics, there's still a million different ways you can put them together. That was the fun part of making this game for me. How can I build interesting, challenging levels around the simple base mechanics of Super Climb Up? How can I make a cool finale that feels different than the rest of the game, but still makes use of the skills that players will have built up by this point? My answer to that was just really focus on the platforming and obstacle dodging, and less on the block breaking, adding in new hazards like bottomless pits, lightning bolts, and floating jellyfish. And those move in a new pattern that players won't have encountered yet at this point. One thing that ended up being really interesting that I hadn't anticipated was making the clouds themselves damage the player when they shoot out lightning bolts. Previously, I'd already had platforms that disappear, but platforms that periodically damage the player instead of just disappearing ended up feeling different in a small but super noticeable way. I think it's really cool how a seemingly small change can completely alter the way something feels or the ways players will approach it. Like, you get antsy when a platform is going to disappear, but there's ways to recover it. Like, maybe you'll land somewhere safe or such. Like, even if the cloud is above spikes or something, you can still use your double jump to get out of there, you know? But if the cloud's gonna hurt you, if you keep standing on it, then there's an immediate guaranteed penalty there, so you're gonna dance around or just book it a lot more readily, you know? None of this is anything really revolutionary or rocket science or anything like that, but I think that's still worth paying attention to, you know? A good game is made out of a lot of little things that all build up into something greater than the sum of its parts, you know? That's the fun of making a game, is thinking about all these different little pieces and how they add up together. But yeah, that's Super Climb Up. I could really just sit here and talk about every single little detail, but I wanted this to be a nice little overview of the game and the thought processes I went through in making it. I think the video is still kind of long, but believe me, this is the short version. And also, like, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's so many of these little loose ends to be found among older games. So many ideas that got a single shot and then were never returned to or expanded upon, or in some cases only rarely touched again, like the first Adventure Time game being one of the only games I know of to revisit Zelda 2's concept directly, for instance. And there's so much room to explore there. Like, this is just my take on expanding Ice Climber. It's such a simple game, there's a million places you could go with it. And someone else could turn it into something completely different from where I went with it. You know, maybe you'll give it a shot too, or give any of these old ideas a second go. There's so much out there to try. And of course, I also hope maybe I made this game sound interesting and you'll give it a try over on Steam. or itch.io. Plus, now that my remaster is out, I've made my original take on it free over on itch.io if you'd like to give that one a look as well. And also, thanks for checking out the debut video on my new main channel. This channel is going to be just for talking about whatever, since over on my racing channel, I often get people telling me that they're not even super interested in racing games specifically, and just like listening to my voice, and would enjoy hearing me talk about anything. So, here's the place for that. My racing channel is probably still going to get the most content, because I just have kind of an endless stream of things to say about racing games, but I've got a good handful of topics lined up for this one too. So far it's mostly odd old arcade games, but I'll talk about game dev stuff on here more in the future too. I like this concept of talking about the process of making games. I think it'd be fun. But yeah, as for now, I will see you again soon.